start off before I start, or should I just go ahead
Uh,
right away?
Probably like if you provide a brief recap of last evening session and set the pitch for today's
Sure.
session, then we can take it.
Sure, I will do that. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
So good evening, colleagues. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for making it for today's session, being a Sunday evening. So I appreciate you coming over and spending some time today. So today's topic is somewhat building upon yesterday's webinar. And yesterday's webinar was most focused around the topic of climate change in general. And then starting to narrow some of that.
Sir, sorry to interrupt. We lost your screen share.
Are you able to see it or no?
No. We lost the presentation.
Okay, hold on.
Sure.
Let me just the entire thing. Is it okay now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay. No, please let me know if that happens again.
Sure, definitely. Yeah.
So yesterday I talked on the topic of climate change, more in general, and then related more to what's the cause, what are the effects, what are the impact areas, and then started to narrow it down and distill it down further towards a rural context, what it means, and I ended it by pointing to two areas which I feel are connected to the issue or topic of climate change, namely on clean energy and on education. These are the two topics which I have also been requested to look at as part of the Humanitarian Technology Conference and the general initiative for the Bangalore section. So building upon that message from yesterday, today I'm going to focus a little more specifically on clean energy technologies, how education could be used as technology aided as pillars for environmentally sustainable rural livelihoods and rural development. So that's going to be the focus for today's webinar. Please let me know. I've just moved a slide. I just wanted to do a check if everyone can see the new slide being posted.
Yes, sir. We are seeing,
can you please?
Yeah. We are seeing recap C3E2.
Okay, fine. So yesterday I brought up this slide and I thought I will bring it up again just to provide a recap of the context around climate change, clean energy and education. I've just given it a little acronym, C3E squared for climate change and clean as a C cube and E squared for education and energy. So yesterday, as I mentioned, I focused on tenets that qualify and quantify it. And I think it was very clear that, hopefully it was clear that there is no distinction between rural or urban, land, sea or air. There are no borders. The impacts of climate change are all pervasive. So what we do at the global level impacts local and multiple locals impact global and so on, right? Connected with climate change, I feel that there's a very strong correlation between climate change, clean energy, which is fairly obvious, and education, right? So today I wanted to dive a little bit more into the clean energy part, what's appropriate and what's relevant for specific local or regional areas. What are different delivery and consumption models that may make sense? With respect to education, what should we be focusing on? What's relevant? Who's the audience? I think delivery mechanisms are more clear and well known, but I prefer to focus on the first two. So I brought up two slides yesterday, and I'm going to recap. And I did not go into the details of these two slides at the end because I was reserving them to set the context for today's discussion in each of the areas. One, of course, being on clean energy and the other on education. Right? But anyway, just to recap what we are talking about with respect to clean energy, I think if we recollect yesterday's discussion around increasing greenhouse gas emission, namely carbon dioxide, methane, and other CHGs, I think becomes very imperative for all of us to understand, and the takeaway from there is that it's very, very important for us to start flattening the energy curve, right? We have got very used to flattening the COVID curve right now in the last 2 months. We have heard that a million times on TV. But I think it's also very important for us. Climate change is going to be a long-drawn affair, far, far bigger and far more long-drawn than the current pandemic. So it's important for us to also understand and realize that flattening the energy curve is extremely important, right, to mitigate the effects of this unnatural imbalance in energy that man has created, which is resulting in destruction of the natural environment and change in natural geographical landscapes, right, due to desertification and so on and so forth. So if we look, there are certain goals, right? I'm not going to go through the details of each and every line here, but I think the theme is, if you look at Paris agreements and so on and so forth, the question is, we all know that temperature on the average is increasing. It's increasing a lot more in certain areas compared to others, but on the net, it is definitely on the upward trend. And we are seeing the effects of that in terms of rainfall impacts, in terms of water depletion, in terms of ocean acidification, all these things that we talked about yesterday. It's all related to this imbalance in energy. Now, climate scientists typically, quote this 2 degrees Celsius increase in global temperature beyond which all bets are off, and we reach a tipping point where the negative effects of climate change, unnatural climate change, perhaps become irreversible. Right? A lot of naturalists and climate scientists have already been using the terms of catastrophic climate change. Right? So there are multiple futures which are possible. Right? Now, if we come to the area of clean or green energy, which is extremely important to help address this, there are different plans, different policies, and different futures depending on how we adopt clean and green energy technologies, at what rate and at what pace. What is the fraction of renewable energy that comes into our overall energy grid and system? How much we focus on energy efficiency, right? These are the two weapons that we have. So one possible future is listed here on this slide. There are two possible futures, right? So one future is, we keep improving stuff and, at about 1.8 to 2% per year from now till 2050, right? And renewables become perhaps about quarter of total energy supply, right? Modeling shows that this is grossly insufficient to meet climate goals related to the 2 degrees Celsius change. Whereas if we double our renewable and energy intake over the next 10 years and then continue to improve at 2 to 3% per year thereafter, whereby renewables now becomes, rather than 24% or 25%, it's 40% higher, about 65%, there's a good chance that, we will meet the climate target goals that we have in mind. But one thing I wanted to point out, irrespective of all these models of energy that we have, there is one important element that we also need to keep in mind is, yes, while we move towards renewable energies, green energy technologies, and so on and so forth, it is imperative on us to also start thinking about ways in which we can reduce our individual consumption. Yesterday, I talked about, if we take a 1 unit of energy, right? It's an abstract context. 1 unit of energy for somebody to lead a basic sustainable life, a reasonable life, right? How much a country in Africa consumes probably about 0.6 units or so. In India, it's about 0.8 units. In Europe, it's about 4 units, and United States and North America, it's about 8 units. So there is significant disparity in per capita energy consumption across the globe. There is significant difference and inequitable consumption between middle class, upper class with respect to wealth, and of course the underprivileged, right? There's a very large gap. Now, I think there was a question yesterday related to this topic, and why aren't people enforcing and meeting these climate goals? I think it becomes very important when we look at this slide and look at ourselves and look at societal structure that the privileged, the ones who are consuming a lot more, I think it becomes more imperative for them to start significantly reducing consumption. Right, because if we model the entire planet as in order to lead a comfortable life, a successful life, a developed life, what that means remains to be in question. All models will throw this energy consumption out of the window, right? And we are back to the same square. So while we talk of renewable energy and energy efficiency, we must equally talk about reduction in consumption. Let me move on for today. So today, so we covered some of that context yesterday. So today I just wanted to show this slide and 2 possible futures. There could be many more depending on our adoption of renewable energy and how we make technologies more efficient. So let's switch a little context towards rural India, right? Now, rural India has a very different mix of energy supplies today. Some of it for mobility is based all of fossil fuels. They have energy grids coming into villages. Some of it is a mix of solar. Some of it, gas comes in by cooking gas. It could be firewood. It could be a mix of so many different things. So while we look at clean energy for rural India, this is perhaps clean energy for irrespective, right? Whether it's rural or urban, I think few things or requirements still need to be met. Some of them are fairly obvious. You want high quality, right? Stable power, stable voltage, current, frequency, and so on. You want low cost per kilowatt hour so that it's affordable, so that people use less environmentally degrading technologies, burning firewood, deforestation, and so on and so forth, and move towards clean or green energy technologies. Financing models become very important in this. I think another question that keeps arising more often is how do we get rural communities more self-sufficient at the local or regional level? So there's this concept of DRE, where decentralized rural energy, right? So that communities are somewhat self-sufficient. You are not having the additional costs and complexities of stretching your centralized grid to remote areas. Remote areas produce the power in whatever ways that's possible, and they consume that power, right, in a sustainable way. Energy efficiency with minimal losses that we know, minimum waste, and recycling. This recycling part, I think I want to state it a little more because it has a significant component when it comes to renewable energy technologies, which I will explain a little bit more as we go forward. Now, although we talk of clean and green energy, environmental impact assessment is still a necessity, right? So whether we use solar or wind or electric mobility technologies with batteries and so on and so forth, at some point of time, owing to recycling, owing to waste, owing to the technology itself, environmental impact assessment needs to be done. And I'll touch upon that a little bit, right, as we go forward. And the requirements really are, there are so many disparate or power energy needs, but be it for agriculture, which is the prevalent or one of the most significant livelihood mechanisms in rural, lighting, cooking, mobility, computing is becoming more as more people get access to computing, even at the low end. And of course, community services, be it shopping areas or be it recreation areas and so on and so forth. So what are the different clean energy technologies which I think could be useful? And I'm sure on the call we have folks who are very experienced and who have delivered some of these technologies. I think Sri Ashok Das, who delivered the first session on Monday, has done a lot of phenomenal work in microgrids in rural India. So top of my head, I can think of him as one person who can definitely talk a lot more about this. So what I'm going to do is to just give a broad swipe of the different technologies which I think make relevance. Right. So one of them in this DRE, in this decentralized rural energy scheme is or are solar grids. Right now, there are different scales of solar grids that one can deploy in rural areas. It could be at the micro level, depending. All this is based off how much power and energy you wish to generate. Right. So there are 3 or maybe 4 or maybe even more classes, right? This is not cast in stone, but these are just relative comparisons as to, the size of panels and so on and so forth, and the amount of power and energy that you need. So as part of deploying solar grids, right, and I think a lot of people, everyone is familiar basically with this concept, right, of solar technologies and solar panels. Perhaps you have it at your home or for your solar heating. You can see that there's progressively increase in efficiency and energy generation per unit area, right? Typically, you take a solar panels about an average person's height and about half their height in terms of width, and the amount of power that you get is anything between say about 250 watts to about 300 watts, and efficiency is very important factor in terms of photovoltaic cell efficiency. And all these are active research areas to go improve on. I think somebody asked a question about this yesterday, and this is one of the things to definitely go look at. How do we increase energy efficiency and energy density and power density generation per square area? Right. But having said all this, I think a few key considerations come top of mind, right? The first one is, solar obviously requires on the sun being available, right? And so there is a limited or some duration during the day when, solar power ramps up and then it ramps back down, right? And it's during those hours where solar generation is at its peak. You can see that even in your normal solar, water heaters that you have at home, it takes a little while to warm up. Just as a simple example, right? In order to provide really the continuous delivery of power, battery backup, battery storage is a very critical element as part of the solution, right? So that when you have not just cloudy days or rainy days, even on a normal day, when daytime is over, what do you do at night? You need to store this energy somewhere to supply it in a stable fashion to homes and other areas that may need this. Another key consideration as part of setting up these solar grids, where it's micro or nano and so on, is the maintenance cycle, right? So there's a maintenance cycle for solar panels. They have to be cleaned to retain their efficiency. The question is, how are they to be cleaned? I think simple ways of using water is one, right? They are more sophisticated, cleaners and dusters and robotic dusters. Those do not, in my opinion, apply in a rural context. They perhaps apply more in an industrial level solar grid farm. Right? But nevertheless, that has to be done. And where is that water going to come from? Is it easily accessible? How much water is needed? And all this depends on the size of the grid that you have. Same thing with batteries. What are the battery technologies, whether it's lead acid or something more sophisticated? They all require maintenance, right? And all this adds to cost, and all this adds to additional resources being needed. So this has to be planned for. Then is capacity addition, right? This has to be planned, right? You can see from the diagrams that each panel, say on the average, generates approximately 300 watts. If you have a sudden surge or need for energy, so this may become a challenge, right? So this needs to be planned. So the way you lead your life and the way the community leads its life, it has to plan its energy resources. It cannot be just ad hoc, in my opinion, right? Then you come to pico and nano grids, which are smaller scale grids, which are optimized in terms of cost and so on and so forth. And it's also optimized in terms of environmental impact, how much water you need to clean, where do you install this, are you dislocating or disrupting local ecosystems? All this depends on the size of the grid, right? I mean, this stuff has to be installed somewhere. This representative picture here is only just a few homes, but imagine a village or a small town, right, with tens of thousands of people powered by solar, right? You're going to be disrupting something somewhere, right? It has to be put on land. How sensitive is the land on which you're installing? Simple questions like this become a little more complex. So that's why that environmental impact assessment is important. And at the end of the day, all these technologies, just like anything else, has a lifetime. I use solar power at home for water heating for the last 15 years, and I had to replace mine about 4 or 5 years ago, right? And it all depends on the type of technology, where it comes from, the cost, there's that trade-off. And recycling panels and batteries, right? These are two critical things. In a rural setting, what is going to be available for recycling this material? They shouldn't end up being put in a dump somewhere. As you grow grids, and those grids, their panels reach their lifetime and have to be disposed of, there's a cost for disposal, right? So I think while we look at solar grids, there need to be parallel technologies which are very actively planning now, not 10 years from now or 5 years from now itself, on recycling, transporting efficiently, recycling them in a safe manner and disposing them. Now batteries, typically the batteries that come into battery backup power systems, in many cases, second life batteries, right? So I'll talk about electric mobility in a little while, but there is a huge market for lithium-ion cells which are no longer capable or have the charge capacity and the amount of current and power they can deliver in a short time, which are no longer suitable for vehicle use, which can find a lot of use in second life. Having said that, while it finds a life as perhaps battery backup for lower intensity power like lighting and so on and so forth, safety and is also an important consideration. Now, I think India has seen a number of wind farms deployed. If you go by air, I especially enjoyed seeing the wind farms going on air between Bangalore to Mumbai. Bangalore to Mumbai, I've seen sometimes on clear day, a lot of these wind farms are deployed, I think, in northern Karnataka from the air on a clear, nice day. No, so those types of wind farms may not entirely be appropriate depending on the size of the rural setting that we have, right? So wind energy has a lot more variability for power generation. I mean, I've just put here a wind power equation, but essentially it's related to the surface area of your turbine, of your blades, plus the speed or velocity of the wind, right? And even a halving of wind speed could result in a power drop to 1/8 of what you have of the original power because of the cubic relationship. What I feel is, and depending on the rural size and setting in context, I think this hybrid model of solar and wind, I think, will be a good winning combination where solar is used actively during the day, and especially in coastal areas where wind speed usually picks up in the evening, right? I think there is an opportunity to leverage higher wind speeds towards the evening and night where solar starts dropping down. So, and in certain other geographical areas, all this is depending on geography, the heating of the land, thermal currents, and so on and so forth, right? I think there is a good opportunity where one can complement the other. But, it also has the other considerations related to maintenance and safety and second life and battery backup and additional maintenance of turbine and generator which needs to be done. So there is all this also has to be factored in, right? I mean, when we talk of rural energy, when we say that it has to be decentralized and self-sustaining and managed, there's still costs that have to be managed. Right? Somebody has to pay for its maintenance and replenishment and so on and so forth. One important thing, maybe less relevant because we probably will look at lower form factor sized wind farms, even in terms of the wind turbine, not these huge blades, but smaller blades, maybe 5-10 meters and so on. Is the position and size, and why I say this is, and the location. Why I say this is, I mean, there are many studies of large capacity industrial wind farms, and the environmental impact assessment there has again got to do with what land area you take, and more importantly, what airspace you take. Unfortunately, sometimes the knowledge of migratory bird movements sometimes gets discounted or forgotten in this equation, and it becomes disruptive to the natural biodiversity that exists. So I encourage a little bit of study and planning before installing them. May not have so much of impact in small rural settings in case this solution is used, but if it's planned to use in larger size villages or small towns, then definitely this is something to look at, because you're putting this in an agricultural area where typically there's a lot of birds and other population that forms the ecosystem. So something to keep in mind. So this is as far as electricity generation goes. Now, one thing which I have not covered here intentionally, and it's for two reasons. One is I have not really studied it too much. And the second one is I'm a little doubtful on the positive effects vis-a-vis environmental impact, is micro dams. So I do know that a number of folks have installed micro dams for harvesting water and for energy generation. But given that it in some way impacts the natural flow of water, so I am not yet equipped to make even a basic commentary on that. So that's why I have not included it in this presentation. It is an option, but I would be a little cautious, because we do know large-scale industrial dams, while they have been extremely beneficial in terms of providing power and irrigation, it has come at a cost of overall environment. And this is something countries have figured out over decades. It's a long drawn affair. Now, micro dams taking from smaller streams or tributaries of small rivers, it could have a similar impact down the road, as opposed to solar and wind, which I feel are less disruptive right now. My personal context, right, or opinion, but I stand to be corrected. But for this reason, I have not included it by design in this presentation. Now, what are the energy sources related to cooking, right? I think biogas is a great opportunity, especially in areas that rely on traditional organic farming methods with a lot of livestock. Right? It's kind of self-explanatory. The natural decomposition, anaerobic digestion results in the generation of methane. Kind of similar to what happens underneath the permafrost, which has been frozen, what we talked about yesterday, which is now melting and releasing methane. Very similar concept. Right? It's a great option. Right? It's perhaps even a viable option even where industrial farming is used, as long as there is sufficient livestock and small farms and grazing areas where the livestock can feed upon. One important consideration is, because of the cost related to setup, it's perhaps efficient to have common units for multiple households, right? And if you look at the methane emitted, right, this is definitely a great option vis-a-vis going to the forest every day and cutting firewood and burning it. One is there's a negative impact related to deforestation for fuel, which is mitigated here. And on the average, this is thumb of rule, right? So one unit or one biogas plant could potentially save, 4 to 5 tons of firewood. And then the associated, pollution due to particulate matter, as well as, incomplete burning, which again results in carbon dioxide, monoxide, and methane, and so on, right? So we save on that. And if you look at the larger scheme, we have the very successful project by Government of India, Ujjwala, in distributing cooking gas, right, to multiple villages and rural communities. But think of the energy now you can save in avoiding that, where local communities generate what they need for cooking. Right from generation to delivery, that's a life cycle you can avoid. So it's a significant energy saving there. Let's come to the area of electric mobility. Right now, I think this is a topic that can be debated in a rural context. But I thought that I would bring it up in any case, because I think there is a definite model here that can be used. I think Ravikiran Annaswamy is talking about general electric mobility in India, I believe, tomorrow or sometime later this week. So I think he will provide more details. But if you just look from a clean energy concept, right, electric vehicle per unit energy input is 6-7 times far more efficient than a traditional internal combustion engine. But whichever way you look at it. So just from an efficiency standpoint, an electric vehicle makes so much of sense in terms of input to output energy conversion. Right? That's how the technology is. Now, I'll be a little careful when I talk about electric mobility. These is electric motor, induction motors, DC drive motors, and so on. I'm not necessarily going to argue or specify the source of that electrical energy. Today, it is lithium-ion or lead-acid batteries. Tomorrow, it could be fuel cells. There is talk of aluminum air cells and so on. So that technology, I think, is maturing very fast. As long as it can drive an electric motor in an efficient form, that's, I think, the discussion point here. I'll worry less about that technology evolution. The primary factor there is cost. So, things like older lithium-ion or existing lead-acid battery technologies may work reasonably well. You don't need the cutting-edge stuff. But that's a parallel discussion, which I think I will not get into, right, for this discussion here today. So what are the key considerations now when you look at electric mobility, right? Is it ripe for adoption in rural areas? I think there is a significant opportunity for certain types of form factors. Two-wheelers, three-wheelers. I think two-wheelers, I think it's evident. There's been an explosion in Bangalore and other cities. Three-wheelers too. I mean, we are yet to see the growth in Bangalore, but definitely it's there in Delhi, in Kanpur, in Amritsar, and other places that I have been to, right? There's an increasing investment made for electric mobility for farm equipment, namely tractors. So there's been a flurry of announcements in the last couple of months on usage of electric vehicle technology in tractors and so on. So I think there is a significant opportunity there in terms of using clean green energy for farming. The key factors here is entry cost. So somebody asked the question of, why aren't people adopting green technologies and so on, and I gave a long drawn-out answer related to that, and it's cost, and it's sadly that cost that upper middle and wealthy classes, for reasons beyond my understanding, are failing to invest in, right? So I don't want to repeat that discussion today, but you can go back to the recording to see my commentary there. So cost is one. And then there is a maintenance and operations cost related to the electric vehicle technology at hand, right? Then there is also a usage model which we have to look at, right? Now, in a rural context, how are two-wheelers and three-wheelers being used? What are the use cases? Is it just a couple of kilometers a day in transportation needs? Farm equipment. What is the total daily usage of farm equipment? Is tractor usage likely to be heavy, meaning 6 a.m. to 4 p.m.? I'm just throwing some numbers. I'm not a farmer, so I need some education on that. So these are some of the questions, right? And then comes, what is the appropriate technology perhaps for these form factor of vehicles and the type of usage, right? Today we have two. One is, I'll fixate now on battery, right? I'll forget about the other areas. Fixed versus swappable battery technologies. So I will cover a little bit about both of them and what I think may be more appropriate in a rural context. So the important thing that I take away from this picture, let's look at fixed battery technologies, right? Now, typically, let's take lithium-ion, right? Because that's what is in vogue and very ideal for powering electric vehicles. Existing lead-acid technologies are slowly getting replaced. But there is a specific life cycle related to charging that we cannot ignore, right? Owing to the chemistry of batteries that we have today, how charge capacity is built up. So there is a period in charging where current is constant as the cell voltage in the overall battery package builds up, and then there is a gradual exponential decay as the total charge capacity exponentially reaches its maximum, right? So this is a thing of physics and chemistry which cannot be avoided, right? And there is also recommended rates at which you can charge a battery, right? They are called C levels. Typically, you charge at 0.5 C to 1 C, which is around on the average of 2.5, 3 amps to about 5 amps. It could be more depending on the capacity of the battery. It's kind of related to the charge capacity of the battery, right? Now, for fixed battery solutions, let's look at two-wheelers, three-wheelers, right? Typically, they have a rating of about 2 kilowatt hours of charge capacity, of energy that they can provide, right? And in a rural setting with microgrid and with the charging current which is needed, I think this is a very viable model, right? If you look at tractors and so on and so forth, where the battery capacity is significantly much higher, I'm not exactly sure, so I've just taken a rough stab of about 15 to 20 kilowatt hour. Charging even with 15 amp could require many hours of charging, right? This leads to downtime, right, for fixed battery solutions. So the usage of a tractor could become a concern. Now you could argue, well, I can do this at the night, maybe, but understand that this 15 kilowatt hour could probably drain fairly fast. So the tractor might not be usable for that entire period of 6 a.m. to 4 p.m. So it may run out in a couple of hours, right? What numbers I've seen so far is, my guess is that peak utilization, maybe 4 or 5 hours of usage before you have to charge it, my guess, right? So which means that there is a portion during the day when the tractor is not usable, right? Because it's run out of charge. Now, if you decide to plug in and charge it at that point, it's completely suboptimal use. So this technology may or may not be entirely the best for this type of usage, like tractors and heavy duty, right? The costing model is very important for clean energy, for electric mobility, right? Fixed battery, there's a leasing, I recommend a leasing, model, which I think has been used in the market already. It's very attractive, right? And charge points, in my opinion, are best. I think the design and location of them, in my opinion, should be with where the microgrid is, right? Because then you concentrate your charging infrastructure there. It's perhaps you can build additional storage or sheds where you take care of thermal and safety related issues, right? Let's understand that, this is, while simple to use, there is still the complexity of, thermal and safety if we do ad hoc installation in rural homes, and then how intrusive that is going to be and so on. So I think this is an opportunity for collaboration between grid providers and mobility providers. I think there is some opportunity there. IoT plays a very important role whenever we talk about, in the previous cases of solar or wind, or in the mobility case, because it provides you an opportunity to look at energy consumption patterns, faults, problems, rectifying them remotely. So IoT is all pervasive if you look at it from the rural energy space, especially, right? I think it's a very useful tool to start consolidating and start driving towards how well these technologies are being used and where they can be further optimized in terms of efficiency. Battery swap, right? This is a solution a little close to heart because I was in a company which developed the world's first platform, common platform for two-wheeler and three-wheeler battery swapping technologies, right? About a year ago, year and a half ago. For the two-wheeler, three-wheeler case, given its model of usage in a rural setting, may not be the most optimal. But I think in terms of this tractor and heavy-duty usage model, because the charge life cycle is exactly the same as fixed charging. It's only whether the battery is portable or not. So the battery swapping model is very similar to going to a petrol station today and refueling. Here, refueling means taking the depleted battery out and inserting a fully charged battery in. But that requires a dispensing station to be available for you. I think in this tractor model, depending on usage, depending on charge depletion, I think there's an opportunity, again, like in the fixed battery case, to have charging stations co-located, charging and battery swapping stations co-located with the grid provider. Again, from safety, thermal considerations, and so on and so forth, where people come in, they swap a depleted battery for a fully charged one, and then they continue their set of operations, right? Just like in the previous fixed battery case or in the solar and wind and anything else, IoT is very, very critical. Data is very critical because using this data, technology can be improved, right? The rural usage patterns may be different and the challenges may be different compared to urban, right? The effects of shock and vibration, perhaps a lot more on rough rural roads, tractors running in in farm areas as compared to urban, perhaps better roads. Maybe not in all cases, we have bad roads everywhere, but I think some of these characteristics and then the pattern of drive, right, perhaps will be more predictable and perhaps less violent in rural areas as compared to urban because nobody is pressing the accelerator and trying to go at 100 kilometers an hour, right? All these has negative impacts. So data collection from an IoT perspective and apart from this other value proposition, very important. So this is about green technology, for clean energy, right? So I just thought I will just share some perspectives on this before I move on to the education part, right? Now I wanted to recap a little bit on what we talked about education yesterday. The key mantra is as follows, right? So technology is an aid to assist in equitable, very important that word, equitable and bidirectional access to and flow of knowledge and traditional educational structures, right? So what do I mean by that, right? It says a lot of things, right? So I think in terms of a rural setting, right, this is true of urban, but I think it is even more relevant in the rural space. The first thing in education that I would like to talk about, although it is not directly connected to technology, but leveraging technology in the right way and providing the right social structure to benefit from education, I think the most important thing here is women's empowerment in education in a rural setting. Now, incidentally, so we see rural women's success in microfinance, panchayats, and so on and so forth, right? The same thing needs to happen in education. Women in rural education in India is significantly lower than in urban. And I think enough models have shown, enough states or countries where women empowerment through education and then know-how and the ability to make decisions and choices has resulted in far better socio-economic status and how society is structured as a whole. I'll give you an example. In India itself, world over, Kerala is taken as a model for high rural education of women and the subsequent empowerment, which has led to very effective control of population. If you take the current, even the COVID situation today that we have, women ministers and due to the empowerment of women in rural communities and in urban areas, very effective means of control in a very densely populated part of the country, right? If you look at, and Kerala's model, even in the current context, and the role of women has recently been brought about in the MIT Technology Review article. Right. Another thing to look at in terms of even this coronavirus situation, there's so many articles and examples of where women leaders leading countries far more effective, whether it is small or large countries, in addressing the situation. So there's a strong correlation here, right? And this is related to also one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals of addressing gender equality. And there is a point here which may be a little hard to read, but it is under SDG 50, where women's specific knowledge of and dependence on forests again, look at rural setting, makes them key contributors to forest conservation and regeneration. This has already been identified. Right? You look at SDG 6 on the lower left side. Women and girls play a central role in the provision, management, and safeguarding of water and sanitation. All these are ingredients which we are looking at, some of which we talked about yesterday in terms of conservation, environmental sustainability, and so on. So I think this is a first important thing. And how we as technologists can help in addressing this, I think is key. I think we have an equal responsibility to look to see how we can facilitate. I come from a little different perspective. Perhaps many of you may share the same. I think education should not be thought of, I brought about this yesterday in terms of, it should not be thought about as a one-way street, that we folks in universities, in IT companies, in the urban sector, we have to impart knowledge to rural people, folk communities and students and adults living in rural settings, because somehow we know better or we know more. I would challenge that. I think there is an opportunity for educating in India, right? Educating urban India. What do I mean by that? Right? This is my personal view. Right? I think rural India has a lot to offer urban India and students. In order to address clean energy, climate change, all these things, as I mentioned yesterday, it's a highly interdisciplinary field. There needs to be a know-how of how natural world, ecosystems, geographies, landscapes, apart from just knowing technology. Right? So, rural context settings, where organic, traditional farming, where what are the mechanisms and principles that have been used over decades, millennia for soil health, understanding the water cycle in a remote setting, which may be very local to that particular area, how they manage traditionally crop rotation, what is meant by permaculture, what are the different geographical landscapes in the area that have to be taken into account. I think there is a lot that rural India can teach urban India and people like us, so that we provide more meaningful solutions. Right? What are the crops, livestock, how do they use them, why do they have certain types of livestock, what are the benefits, how they view insects. You'll never find, because I have in my home, I employ a gardener who comes from a very rural setting. The way he looks at plants and insects is very different than how I used to look at it. I've learned a lot from him the last 15, 20 years in my home. And now I start to use his principles and I find a lot of benefit. Right? So I think educating urban India on sustainable farming, okay, is also a means of livelihood. They teach us as opposed to we assuming we know everything and teaching them. Right? They build our awareness. They share knowledge using technology, distance learning. We have enough of these technologies. What is important is to leverage this to provide them a livelihood and to provide them a platform where they can teach us. The photo I have here is actually of a school in Mangalore which has made farming a compulsory subject for primary to middle to high school students. I think that's a fabulous idea. Right? And it's something that I would promote. Only if the students of today, we are custodians of their future. And even ourselves start learning little bit about farming and what is really involved, what is soil, what is air, what is water, where does all this stuff come from, right? How does it magically appear in the plastic wrapper in the grocery store? Right? I think then only we'll be able to give meaningful solutions. Right? Tribals, our Adivasis, I think they have a lot of knowledge developed over millennia related to forestry, vegetation practices, which we have many times ignored at our own peril, which we are only beginning to realize now. Right? So I think there needs to be this flow of information back into urban India, right? India is very unique because we have had rural communities for generations. I'm talking of thousands of years. Right? Urbanization is a more recent phenomenon in India. So I think we have a huge opportunity. Even if you look at cooking ware and diets or medicines and so on, right? This is also livelihood and opportunities for people. In my home, this is photo actually taken from the vendor who provides my home with all traditional cookware. I don't buy anything for the last 5 to 10 years from any shop. Everything comes from the village, right? Whether it is cast iron, whether it is clay, whether it is stoneware, the different types of vessels which provide phenomenal cooking efficiency, heat retention, the style of cooking rather than applying a flame torch, type approach which is in modern cooking today, right? All of which impacts health. Traditional medicines, I think India has a lot of strengths in that. So what I'm coming to is that, when we look at rural India and education, I think there is a huge opportunity for reverse flow, for us to learn collectively and jointly to address the solutions which we are facing today related to climate change and so on and so forth, right? What is very important is also, we have talked about green farming. Everybody knows about the green revolution, right? Which Dr. Swaminathan was a great proponent of, and he did a fantastic job. Thanks to also Norman Borlaug. Some of you may have heard his name, right? He is the Nobel Peace Prize winning farmer with a PhD in genetics and biology from Minnesota, an Iowa-based farmer who really, out of compassion, developed the mechanisms and the technologies for high-yielding wheat and rice, tripling, quadrupling the yield per acre, right? This resulted in our green revolution, which resulted in India becoming self-sufficient in food. I think he has to be applauded along with Dr. Swaminathan, right? They eradicated hunger while preserving land and preventing excessive use of land owing to lower yields, right? Which would have resulted in a lot more deforestation at that point. But I think we need to also now look from a different lens, right? We are now in an industrial food system, right, which uses 10 calories of energy to provide roughly 1 calorie of food of questionable value sometimes. It is inefficient with respect to organic farming. The problem for us right now is we are at the confluence of exponential population growth. I talked about that yesterday, 3 billion when I was born. Today it is 7.5 billion, going to about 10 billion or more by 2050. Right? It is, in my lifetime, probably it will be 3 times population in the earth. Right? How is organic farming scalable enough to provide the yields to feed such population? That's what led to green revolution, the industrial farming of pesticides, fertilizers, and so on and so forth. But that has come at a huge cost, which we all know. Topsoil degradation. Eventually, the land becomes unusable for farming, right? And then we have to go somewhere else to get arable land. That arable land today is depleting. Right? And the consequences are devastating. We are seeing that. Yesterday I gave you the example of Borneo, where we are burning all the forests for palm oil production for farming at an industrial scale. So the question now is, as we look at this model of calories per acre to health per acre, right? How do we cross-pollinate? I think this is where rural and urban need to combine. How do we combine the best of organic and industrial farming? What can we do? If you look at food and climate change today, the industrial food processing engine is about half of all greenhouse gas emissions. Of that 50% of greenhouse gas emissions, 50% of that is owing to non-food related emissions. What do I mean by that? Petrochemicals for fertilizers, insecticides, and so on take up half of this energy. Right? Then there is land use and deforestation, right, which results in less carbon capture and resulting in more greenhouse gas emissions. Then there is transportation, retail, packaging. We are no longer consuming local produce. We all want the imported grapes from Spain, or the imported oranges or apricots from Turkey, or the imported apples from Australia, as opposed to local produce. All this adds to energy. It's all fantastic to talk about, yes, we have supply chains, we have, e-commerce delivery. All this comes at huge cost, okay, which is a hidden cost which we don't obviously see on a day-to-day basis. I'm getting close to the end. I know that we have reached 7 o'clock, so I'll just take a few more minutes of your time. So I think educating rural India is really enabling them with technology, right? So there is a small piece over here. This is from the OECD, the key drivers of rural change, and I'll specifically focus on this future of education, where technology can support education system to better deliver services in remote areas. I think this we know, right? My whole premise is how do we reverse the flow of content and knowledge from rural to urban so that together we learn more, build awareness, and build a more sustainable future, as opposed to assuming that we have all the solutions in the urban context. I just have 2 more slides. So from yesterday's discussion or talk about climate change to today's talk about clean energy and the value of education to facilitate solutions towards adopting clean energy, towards mitigating climate change. We are all very familiar with this flattening the curve thanks to coronavirus in the last 2 months. I will repeat again. So there is a risk and time graph here. And the Paris Agreement, that 2 degrees Celsius, all that stuff, how much of greenhouse gas emissions we need to cut. If you draw a line, it's some element of risk. If we continue business as usual, we are going to have, just like a coronavirus situation, things going out of hand. Exponential environmental disaster, which we may or may not ever recover from. If we actively pursue and adopt renewable technologies, take a holistic view of education, understand what we are trying to solve, change our means of consumption, how we consume, reduce our consumption, reapply that in other areas, that is a climate action piece. Then we have, I think, a future where we can start flattening the so-called energy curve and achieving some measure of success. As a personal note, I wanted to add, while we talk of, all the green and renewable technologies, there is one technology I feel that many people don't want to talk about, but I think I would like to bring to table for larger community discussion is nuclear technology. From my limited understanding, it is the one where there is some optimization related to space taken to quantum of energy generated. Yes, there is this question of safety, of waste, and so on. But I think those are challenges which have been addressed. There have been accidents, far and few between, but I think those are definitely challenges that we can overcome, right? While we figure out how we are going to flatten this curve. Because flattening the curve is not simple. Every moment we are burning fossil fuels, right? And this is going to continue for a significant period of time. So the question now is, before flattening, how can we reduce the slope of that curve, right? Before we flatten and then dip it down, maybe, if at all. So I would like to conclude with one thing. Of all these discussions that we have had and talks and so on and information flow, I think what is very important to keep in mind is hope and getting into action, communicating information. What is climate change? What is impacts? What are the technologies? What is viable? What is not viable? Healthy debates. Everything is on the table. Not having urban-rural divide in terms of we know better, you don't. Not dismissing claims of rural and tribal people, right? Because I think they know a lot more than we value. So the one important thing to keep in mind, I'd like to end on this note is, we are phenomenal problem solvers, perhaps among the best in natural evolution that's been seen on this planet. With respect to this topic of climate change and significant action towards green energy and clean energy adoption, we are just yet to apply ourselves with the scale and urgency that it needs. It's time for us to get to work, and that's the quote I like to end as my person who's been an inspiration for me, whom I look up to. David Attenborough, as he mentioned in the World Economic Forum recently. I think with this note, I would like to conclude today's webinar. My apologies for going a little bit 5-10 minutes over time, and I'll be happy to hand it back to Sri Puneet or Sri Chengappa for further follow-up and address any questions. Thank you. Puneet Chengappa, just back to you. Hello? Hello?
Yeah. So, yeah. So there are questions again. So there are questions that have been there from yesterday. I guess a couple of them were not answered, and then there are.
Okay.
So you'd like them out for you?
Yes, please.
Side cells converting by am I audible to you? Do you think solid
Your voice is little bit breaking.
electricity without combustion? Okay.
Possibly. Again, I'm not an expert in that area, so I can't comment. As long as it's a viable and scalable technology, I think that's what should be there. I think you need some expert in that area to talk about it. It's a very broad field. So I am not particularly aware of the details. Any technology that we adopt needs to be scalable, needs to be safe, and needs to be viable over a period of time, right? These are just the 3 key tenets. So it could be solid oxide cells and so on, but I will leave it at that. Hello? Was I audible, I hope? Anyone there? Hello? Puneet, Ashwini, Chengappa, can anyone hear me?
Narayan, you are audible.
Okay.
Oh, okay. All right. Sorry, I wasn't sure because there was some.
The type.
Is it Madam Ashwini?
Yes.
The voice is very choppy, at least for me.
Okay.
Your voice is very choppy for me.
Hello, sir.
I'm sorry, I'm not able to hear the question.